the four speakers and then open the floor for discussion. Professor Reich will start by presenting some legal aspects. Then Daniel Kolbar will present the perspective of the Israeli Ministry of Economy and some of the preparations for the eventuality of Brexit. Mr. Dan Catarivas will present the perspective of the Israeli private sector. And finally, Professor David Newman will discuss some political aspects of the British Brexit ongoing drama. So I would like to invite and introduce, and need no introduction, but nevertheless, Professor Arie Reich. He is a professor of the Faculty of Law and Dean of Students at the Ilan University and holds a Jean Monnet Chair of EU Law and Institutions, specializes in international economic law, EU law, and has authored over 50 academic books and articles, if not more. He is a member of the ICSID panel of conciliators and arbitrators, has served as the president of our association, the Association for the Study of the, we have to change the name, for the Study of the European Integration, and he is a member of the executive of the International Academy of Commercial and Consumer Law and a national correspondent for Israel to the UNCITRAL. He has served as the chairman of Israeli Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duty Tribunal and as a member of 5 different World Trade Organization, WTO, dispute settlement panels in trade disputes between the US, EU, China, and Russia. He has served as visiting professor in prestigious universities around the world. So we're very honored to have you, Arie. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I really loved this picture as a kid growing up on the Mad magazine, and I saw this, I couldn't help having a laugh. And then I saw this picture, which kind of understood where the characters got his inspiration from. But now let's be more serious. About 3 years ago, 3 years ago and 2 months to be precise, I wrote and published an article about the Brexit. Exactly fit for this topic, because the topic was the EU, UK, and Israel. What to expect? And was published in the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs. Note that I wrote this like only 2 months after the result, the shocking results, I should say, of the referendum. We were still like, okay, wait a second, what's going on? Let's try to understand what's going on. And just towards my lecture here, I reread the article, and it was quite surprised at how many of the predictions actually came true. I mean, I didn't predict the royal mess that they managed to do in the UK. I don't think anybody could predict that. But other than that, there were certain things that that I stood. For instance, the fact that at the time the big issue was whether the Parliament would have the right to decide have a decision whether to actually do the Brexit or not, because the referendum itself was not binding legally. And I said, I think it will go to the Parliament, but the Parliament in the end will respect the will of the people. And this is what happened. And I also spoke about the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, which we don't know yet if there's going to be a no-deal Brexit or not. It's a part of the trickiness of this conference. It was very hard to prepare myself to the conference when you really every morning brings in some other news and twists in the story. But what I wrote is the following. I wrote, if this were to happen, in other words, if we have a no-deal Brexit, before a comprehensive agreement acceptable to the UK was concluded, the UK could find itself in political and legal chaos. It would mean that its industrial export to the EU would be subject to customs duties and other restrictions. Agricultural trade would be hampered by protectionist policies, which are tolerated by the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, because basically we're going back to the WTO Agreement on Agriculture. And trade and services essentially would be reduced to rubble. It would probably bring an end to the London city's position as Europe's center for financial services. End of quote. Well, we don't know if there's going to be a Brexit without an agreement. We also don't know what kind of chaos will result from it. But we can already now see some of the things that were described in this article 3 years ago. in the sense that many banks are moving their offices to other cities, Frankfurt, Paris, and so on. And for instance, I mean, just look at the rate of the British pound to the dollar. Just before the Brexit, the pound was 1.46 to the dollar, and now in October 1st, when there was a very possible possibility for a no deal Brexit, the pound was at its lowest in 1.22. That's a decline of 16%. So yeah, the economy is definitely taking a hit. Another thing I wrote is about EU-Israel relations. I wrote the following. I wrote, it is reasonable to expect a certain decline in the UK's position on the international scene in general, as a result of its preoccupation for the next few years with settling its internal affairs in its relationship with the EU. That indeed has been what has dominated UK politics for the last 3 years, to the point that there are people who are sick of it already. I heard that there is a TV channel that opened a special channel with news, not including Brexit. You know, anybody who's sick of Brexit, you can look at this channel with everything except for Brexit. Of course, as a result of that, the UK has not been as active and influential in its external policy as it could have been. Now, I wrote, and because of its loss of influence within EU institutions. However, the UK still has its permanent seat on the Security Council, which affords a significant power that could be used both in its Brexit negotiations vis-à-vis some of the member state governments and in forging new partnerships with countries outside the EU. It's also possible that because of its increased dependence on the United States, the UK will align its foreign policies in the Middle East with those of the US. Well, I must say, at the time when I wrote this, I did not expect Donald Trump to be elected as the US president and the policies in the Middle East that followed, so I'm not sure that is correct anymore. But generally speaking, I think the atmosphere of the prediction is more or less accurate. Now, so what the UK has done, and it hasn't accepted Professor Wessel's legal opinion that it does not have the authority to conclude international trade agreements. It has negotiated such agreements, but they're very straightforward. They don't create anything new. They're basically there to preserve the existing relationship, roll over, preserve, whatever term you want to use, in order that if there will be a Brexit, and when it will happen, that the existing agreements, the existing about 40 EU trade agreements, will not all of a sudden cease to apply to the UK and to its trade partners, such as Israel, but they will be able to continue exporting and importing duty-free between themselves, as well as all the other provisions that apply as a result of the EU agreement. So in order to solve these conundrum that you raised, regarding pure agreements, mixed agreements, will they continue, will they not continue, etc., the UK took the legal advice, which was actually what I also suggested, is make an agreement. Don't leave it to 3-4 years of litigation. Make a new agreement that says we're preserving what existed before. It reminds me a bit of what Israel did in 1948, grandfathering. The state was born in May 1948. The first law that was passed, Pkudat Sidrei Shilton Mishpat, said all the law that has been enforced in the land of Israel under the British mandate will continue to be in effect from now and onwards, except what will change over time. And the only thing that changed was the White Book, if you remember, about immigration, Jewish immigration. Other than that, everything was preserved. And then over the years, we changed things. This is basically what these agreements are doing. So what the UK has managed to do up to date is to sign, actually it's 18. The exact number now is 18. There was just the Morocco agreement, which was just added just a few days ago. So we now have 18 agreements out of 40 that the EU has signed and which the UK is part of. Now, if we will have a delay of a few months, which we might have, then they might be able to complete and having more of these agreements. You see the various countries. Chile was the first one. They started in January 2019. This goes chronologically. With the last one, Georgia, it says here October 29. We now have also Morocco. So Israel was quite in the beginning, in February 2019. But what is still missing here is important countries such as Turkey. Turkey is a big trade partner of the UK. Because it's a member of the customs union, it's more complicated to forge a trade agreement. Canada, the famous agreement between EU and Canada, does not, they don't have an agreement with the UK, so it will cease to apply. Japan. Now, I put United States in parentheses because there is no free trade agreement between the EU and the United States. But during the campaign, the Brexit campaign, they were bragging, saying, we will leave the EU and then we'll be able to make this great and wonderful trade agreement with the United States and we will gain a lot from it. Well, we're 3 years later and there's not even a starting of a negotiation of such an agreement, which just shows you what, what the campaign was like. So let's talk about the Israel-UK Trade and Partnership Agreement. So this was signed 18 February 2019. It will enter into force when the UK ceases to be an EU member state or at the end of any transitional arrangement. So if we have a transitional arrangement which in the meanwhile allow agreements, foreign trade agreements of the EU to continue to apply to the UK, then only when this ends, then this agreement will come into force and basically preserve the exact situation like we have now. That's the basic idea. It also applies to the agricultural protocols that were signed later on. There were various amendments to the agricultural agreements between Israel and the EU over the years. And also another important agreement called the Agreement on Conformity Assessment and Acceptance of Industrial Products, which has to do with the fact that they will recognize if something has gone through Standard Institute or has been approved by Ministry of Health, for instance, for pharmaceuticals, it's been approved by Israeli Institute, it will be recognized in the EU, and the other way around. In the EU, recognized in Israel. So this will also continue to apply vis-a-vis the UK. That's an important agreement. The agreement also preserves the application of all government procurement agreements. Right now, Israel is a member of the WTO agreement of government procurement. It means that when Israeli government entities and various public corporations and institutions make procurement, they purchase things or products or services, they will not discriminate against suppliers from other European countries. They will not apply the 15% preference for Israeli-made products. Same thing, when Israeli suppliers are competing for contracts, for government contracts within the EU, they will also not be discriminated against. They will get equal treatment to other European suppliers and will be able to gain contracts, government contracts in Europe. So if the UK leaves the agreement, the EU agreements with Israel, because it ceases to be a member, then this would stop. In order to preserve this, the agreement says what it says in order to preserve all that. One of the agreements I'm missing here, and I have no idea what's about it, and it's a really important one, it's the Open Skies agreement. There's no mentioning of it as far as I've seen in this agreement, and this has been very, very beneficial to Israeli tourists, travelers who are traveling really for cheap back and forth. What will happen with the UK? I don't know.
All the companies opened.
What?
All the companies opened branches in the EU, so they're EU companies also.
But what if they travel to the UK? What about the flights that go to UK? I don't know. Because the agreement, as far as I remember, it talks about flying to a EU member and from a EU member to Israel, etc. And if the UK stops to be a EU member, the agreement doesn't apply to it. So I really don't know. I'm just putting a question mark here. I don't have an answer. Now, there are a few problems that I wanted to raise with the agreement. In this article that I mentioned, I raised a few issues about this renegotiation. And I said this is an opportunity to change some of the things in the agreement. Like, for instance, in the agricultural arrangement, at the time the UK is a member of the EU has a common agricultural policy. It includes, for instance, protecting growers of oranges in Spain and Portugal. The UK does not have an interest in protecting them anymore once they leave the EU. So we should have renegotiated, we should have taken out that. And have more, that would open more possibilities for Israeli agricultural export to the UK and vice versa. Unfortunately, as far as I know, this has not happened because the schedule is basically preserving what was. The same thing that was, they just adapted the quotas to fit what the UK market, but they didn't change the essence of the schedules. Another issue that I raised in my agreement, you know, we have this whole severe dispute with the EU regarding export from the territories, from beyond, over the Green Line. And I said this is an opportunity because the UK is going to be under pressure to finalize an agreement. Let's solve this problem once and for all vis-à-vis the UK and say that the agreement will apply to all areas under Israeli control or within the Israeli customs area. That's a simple, elegant solution within the Israeli customs area. Now I read the agreement and at first I was happy because I saw this title, territorial application, and there's a whole section about territorial application, but it only applies to the UK. The UK changed the territorial application. We didn't do anything about it. Why didn't we do anything? I know that it's a politically sensitive issue, but I think this was a great opportunity to do things, and we do happen to have a right-wing government right now, so I really don't know who were sleeping on the watch there. There's also a possible period of vacuum there, because if you read the provision, we could have a situation with a vacuum, because it depends on the countries giving each other notification. So if one country is late in giving notification, we might have a problem with a time where there is no agreement. And another problem that is not a criticism on the agreement, but it can't be solved, it has to be solved vis-à-vis the EU, is that Israeli exporters must remember that once the Brexit goes into force, they cannot count British components as part of what they need for the rules of origin. So the rules of origin, let's say you need 35% or whatever, it depends on the product, 35% Israeli product components or European components, or 45%. Until now you count UK components, German components, Israeli components. From when the Brexit goes into force, you can't count anymore UK. And this was something that needs to be taken care of vis-à-vis the EU. I think that's about it. Thank you very much. Okay. Just we're in university, sorry. We're in university and we have this very important issue of the Horizon 2020. Okay? What's going to happen when the UK leaves the EU? Won't we be able to do a cooperation with our British counterparts anymore because they're not members of the UK? So there is a solution to that. The UK government has declared that it will fund from its own funds, if there is a UK research that has gotten until now money from the EU, that has won one of these tenders to get to be funded, and the EU stops the funding, the UK government will give the funding. So we have this guarantee. So you don't have to be afraid to make a consortium with British researchers, because worst comes to worst, if the EU decides not to give the money because the UK guy is not European, then you're supposed to get money from the UK government. And the UK has said that it intends to apply for associated membership. Just like Israel is not an EU member, but it's still associate member in these R&D frameworks. The UK has said they will do the same. This Horizon 2020 is already towards its end. 2020 is next year, but the next one is called Europe Horizon Europe, and UK will apply to be associate member in that. Although the way it seems is that they're going to discriminate between EU members and non-EU members in this new program. It's not going to be the same way, so we have to take that into consideration. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Arie. So many things, and really had to fight the time. But we'll continue. We will have some more time for discussion later. So we'll go quickly. We expect many answers. Don't feel. We heard some critics about the criticism about the agreement, and now we're going to hear, I guess, some more details about it from Daniel Kolbar. Daniel currently heads the Bilateral Agreements Department at Israel's Foreign Trade Administration, the governmental entity within the Ministry of Economy and Industry responsible for Israel's trade policy and export promotion. In his previous position, Daniel served as Counsel for Economic Affairs at Israel Trade Mission in Rio de Janeiro. Born and raised in Tel Aviv, Daniel holds a few titles and diplomas from various places including Bar-Ilan University. Daniel, the floor is yours. 15 minutes.
Okay, shalom everyone, hello. Good to be here. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about this very interesting subject. I think the date was chosen carefully as well, just a bit before, so that we could have more questions than answers. But while we're at it, let's do maybe something interactive. Not that don't be obliged to raise your hand. But I was wondering, who here thinks that there's going to be a Brexit on the 31st of October? Anyone? Anyone thinks that there will be a hard Brexit eventually at some point? Okay, one person, one brave person. Okay. So the rest thinks that there's going to be an agreement and a Brexit. Or does anyone think there's going to be no Brexit?
What's the percentages?
Okay, so we have one brave man raising his hand near Deutsch, my colleague. No Brexit. Okay. And?
No Brexit.
No Brexit. Okay.
No Brexit.
No.
One more. No Brexit.
No Brexit.
No Brexit.
Okay, so I think the polls here, at least in the
Define Brexit.
College.
Now we have a
That's
title
the reverse Article 50. Okay, yeah, we have.
Didn't ask how many of you simply don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's not one of the options for the for this poll. But yeah, I think we have a title here. Majority of participants at the seminar think that there is going to be no Brexit. Yeah, okay, thanks. So, yes, it was mentioned, we had the Ministry of Economy and Industry together with other colleagues from other ministries, and over the past, I would say month, maybe a couple of years, have negotiated the agreement that we probably should not have signed. But we were one of the first. We've seen that on the slide. One of the first 5-6 countries, and they've reached about half by now. 21 still pending, I think. So what we did there was very important for us, of course. It's very important for the Israeli government and the industry to have a continuation of the conditions that currently apply. We want to send a clear message to the industry that as far as they are concerned, exporters and importers, they can continue to do business as usual, and that's basically the main point. And I think with the agreement signed in February and open to be reviewed and sometimes criticized, we have a transparent agreement that we can all look at and see how it looks like, which is an important thing. So why is it that the UK is important? Let's look a little bit about the trade data. You see here these are the exports from Israel to the top 10 destinations. In 2017 and 18, you'll see that the brighter blue is 2018. By far, the US is leading, and in 2018 there was a huge growth in export to China. You will see compared to 2017, but the UK is number 3. It was number 2 in 2017. So obviously very important. By the way, look at regardless now, it's jumping to another subject. Turkey also gone up in 2018, or destination number 5. So let's look at our bilateral trade. So that's also looking at how much we import. So of course, we are concerned mostly about the exports from Israel, because then we talk about people producing here and working here, etc., generating jobs, etc. But of course, a country like Israel needs to also look about imports. As we import a lot from the UK, you'll see that when we look at both import and exports in 2018, there was actually a growth because the imports have increased. So the UK, in terms of exports and imports of goods, is a very, very important partner. And so that's, of course, something that we look at. And now, if we look at services, trade and services is also very important. Because, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but every year Israel exports more and more services. You can see actually our top destinations all green. In 2018, I think we can see that. That's here. You will see that in 2018 we exported a total of $110.6 billion. 45% of that was the export of services. So we expect a continuation of growth of that. So we see more and more export of services to the UK. The UK was number 2. And this is basically what we do at the Foreign Trade Administration, promote these issues. And if we look at just one of the pillars, which is the trade agreements, quickly review what agreements that we have. Not as many as the EU, so we don't have 40 agreements with many more countries. But we do have agreements since 75, which is the one with the EU, and the years here are the ones that refer to the years where these agreements were signed. By the way, you can see a couple of new agreements, one signed this year with Ukraine, Panama was signed last year, of course the UK that we are here to talk about, and we have also other negotiations, some other agreements. So now I'll say a few things about the UK agreement. But I do have to say before that the negotiations started when I was still in Brazil, and so when I returned to Israel, I looked after other agreements. As you can see, we have quite a bit on our plate. So I was not personally participating in the negotiations, and my colleagues that did, some of them are in China by now, and others couldn't be here. But I'll try the best as I can. To talk about some of the issues that were raised here. So I did tell Rachel before, this is actually some slides that were prepared towards the previous Brexit that was planned. But I did think it was interesting to put some Hebrew here in this event that is, I think, mostly Israelis that are here. When we look about the trade and partnership, so apologies for that, Mr. Ramses, but I'll talk in English so that you can mostly understand. We're talking about the Trade and Partnership Agreement. So those of you who know the EU agreement, obviously the name is different. So that's maybe the first difference between agreements. It starts with the title. So Association Agreement was obviously not, in our view, a relevant name for an agreement with the UK, so we changed that. But in general, the agreement is very much like the EU Association Agreement, and the changes that were made were only the necessary changes. So throughout the agreement and the other agreements that make part of the let's say the trade agreement package, which were also presented before, so I'll probably not repeat them, are only the necessary changes. And the reason for that is that the UK, having practically at that time no Department of International Trade, that had to set up a completely new department, hire all the people, hire someone from New Zealand to head the department. And so they were in no conditions to start opening up 40 agreements and negotiate each and every element of the agreement. So that perhaps answers your question. But it was important for us to have a evolutionary element in the agreements, and there is a joint declaration. It was something that was negotiated for a long time, and on our side we insisted that in a certain time in the future the parties will revise issues related to investment, to services. These are elements that are not included in the association agreement. But for the British, of course, it was important to have as similar as agreement as possible to the one that already exists with the EU. And keeping in mind that that was our goal in the first place, is to have a continuity and to make sure that we have an agreement and that we have it before March 29. Right? And we did sign it a month and a half before the previous deadline. And so we did do any adjustments that were necessary for the ACA agreement. That's the Mutual Recognition Agreement for Industrial Products, currently covering pharmaceuticals. Of course, the TRQs, the quotas, also needed to be adjusted, because for now, when the EU has 28 countries, they have, let's say, a certain quota for certain products as part of our bilateral agreement with the EU. So with the UK, we had to open new quotas. So basically, maybe the important thing to remember here is that we're not, we haven't touched basically the quotas that the 27 European countries will continue to benefit from the same quotas, and the UK are getting additional quotas. So that's generally calculated as a percentage from the EU quotas. There are some small exceptions in some products that we have decreased those volumes. But other than that, what it means is that the EU will continue to have 27, the EU 27 will continue to have the same volumes, and then for imports from the UK, there will be an additional quotas as well. But that works for the exports as well, so Israeli exporters will continue to benefit the same amount of volumes of certain product when they export to the EU 27, and but they will have additional tax-free quotas when they export to the UK. Of course, rules of origin is something also mentioned before as a very important element as well. This is actually an example of an agreement that is not, let's say, plurilateral agreement. There is an agreement where the EU is a party and Israel is party, and other countries as well in the Mediterranean region. So it's called, in short, the PAM Convention. So that's the Euro-Mediterranean Convention. So basically, what it does is that it allows for countries that are party to this agreement to accumulate origin. So that means exactly that some products can be produced in Britain or another European country, or another country that is not in the EU but is party to the PAM Convention, and still enjoy and still be treated as originating product. So in that sense, both the UK and Israel and the EU will continue to be parties to that same convention. So as long as the UK...
Mediterranean.
Mediterranean Convention, yes, exactly. Which is, by the way, is currently being negotiated. I mean, not currently, over the last 7 years, the rules of origin are going to, when the negotiations will be concluded, will be amended. So it will be more flexible in general.
UK is a member of this treaty?
Yes. So unless, I mean, as long as the Britain leaves the EU with an agreement, there will be absolutely no influence for importers that import products from the UK, okay, because they will continue to accumulate. So of course all these issues of rules of origin have been accounted for, and the GPA as well is maintained very similar to what it used to be. We talked about the R&D agreement. Of course, there are other agreements as well. There are agreements that are not a part of the scope of our ministry, so I will not mention them. I think the agreement you mentioned with is Ministry of Transportation, Shamayim Ptuchim, that's the Open Sky Agreement. I think that's actually been concluded, but I'm not sure. Maybe my colleagues from the Ministry of Justice are aware. But from what I've seen, December 2018, they concluded. So Israel is one of the countries with which the UK have moved forward with that. Of course, investment is not something that we have with the EU. Israel has investment agreements, so basically what we call the BAT, protection investment, but with EU member states. There is no agreement with the EU as a whole. And there is another example here, adequacy for privacy, privacy data protection. Thank you very much. So they will continue to consider our data protection as in an adequate way. Of course, so we have some opportunities when we look at that, but we always have to be optimistic. So in terms of one opportunity, I mean, in addition to the trade supposed to continue as it is, we'll be able to bilaterally strengthen the relations with the UK, trade relations that is. So for example, we might be in a position where in the future we'll have services, investment and other elements in a bilateral agreement with the UK that we will perhaps not be able to achieve with the EU. And we'll also, so assuming there is no deal, no trade deal between the EU and the UK, well then Israeli exporters will have a substantial advantage over European companies because we do have an agreement with them. And of course working directly with the British government and not with the European institutions can be sometimes perhaps easier or perhaps more beneficial. So that can be a challenge. Of course, there are challenges as well. We're not so sure about the logistical aspects, if there's going to be any problems, you know, at the ports. Of course, there is a lot of movement of goods, and goods are moved from Israel to the UK. Sometimes they pass through a European port, and vice versa. Sometimes a minor transformation is made to a product, etc. So these are all issues that could eventually influence trade. We're not sure. We think that for now the things are pretty much covered, and from what I've seen, the UK is doing a great job preparing for the Brexit and being very transparent about the procedures, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much also for keeping the time. And we move immediately to dear friend Dan Catarivas. We worked together when I was in the Ministry of Justice. He was long ago, we were at the Ministry of Finance. Presently, Danny holds the position of Director General, Foreign Trade and International Relations at the Manufacturers Association of Israel and Chairman, this is more recent, Chairman of the Israel-EU Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Prior to his current roles, he served 25 years with the Israeli government. His last position was Deputy Director General for International Affairs at the Ministry of Finance, as I mentioned. He served as the first economic counselor of Israel in Beijing, in China, and years ago he also served as representative of the Ministry of, nowadays called Economy, in the Israeli liaison office in Beirut, Lebanon. Mr. Catarivas graduated from, he has a lot of education, I don't need to mention all of it, and we are really looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you. Okay. No, the only thing you mentioned was that the College of Europe, that is relevant. And few Israelis
and he speaks French.
That was interested in Europe many, many years ago. And actually in 1977 I went to study European integration, hopefully being able to apply it here in the region. But as we see what's happening both in the region and in Europe, I'm not sure I was a good choice. Anyway, I don't have a presentation, but I'll try to highlight how we, the private sector, view the whole situation. And actually, I think that both Arie and Daniel have quite, I would say, comprehensively presented both, on the one hand, the problem, but also the answer. I must say, usually I don't commend the government, but in that case, I must say the government did a good job. Usually we're against the government, we are not, and we criticize the government. But in that sense, I must say that this time, it happened sometime, they did a good job, i.e. they definitely understood the major problem, which is the problem of uncertainty, that they have to reduce the level of uncertainty for the businesses, and by actually working out this agreement in February 2018, they actually reduced the level of uncertainty for the companies, i.e. In general, we know that major changes won't happen, okay? But still, I think that we are preoccupied, I think, because it's true that, first of all, we are all preoccupied because we don't know what really is going to happen. So the level of uncertainty is still there. What has been reduced is the level of uncertainty in the future possible relations of Israel and the UK under one certain scenario, i.e. when there is a, let's say, there is a no deal in a way, so there will be a deal in Israel. But again, I think that we are still worrying to see what will happen in the, if there is a deal in the transition, how you apply the agreement during the transition. I think this is something that we don't know what will happen. So in that case, it's not that everything is fine, because again, how this is going to happen. And as you know, businesses, one of the things that they hate the most is uncertainty. So in that case, only one scenario will be taken care of and not the other. Now, the other thing is, I think that we are all preoccupied because the whole atmosphere around international trade and the fact that we refer to WTO is very nice, but the question is the WTO going to function? And how is it going to function? Because we know that there is an attack on the WTO, and for instance, I haven't seen, and maybe I read, but maybe I don't remember, what is the procedure for dispute settlement between us and the Brits when it comes, whether we have our own separate system or we have to go to the WTO. We know that it's going to take time, etc. So I think that here there are still some uncertainty in the future of the relation. Another thing, it's true that the figures, and it's always interesting that you can present the figures, Britain for the Israeli private sector is definitely extremely important, but, and I say but, Britain became the first partner of Israel in Europe, but that was true when we had one big Israeli company that was exporting to Britain, okay? I refer to Teva. Actually, the fact that Teva actually made Britain be our first partner, because the big increase that we had in the last couple of years of export to Britain was the result of Teva activity. You've seen the reduction of export to the UK. It's because, mainly because of Teva. Okay, so here again, sometimes the figures, we must be very careful in actually analyzing the figure. It's not that, and when you see also an increase in import, it's basically because of the pound and the fact that import from Britain became cheaper. Okay, so it's true that we have to look at figure, but we have to look inside the figure and sometimes understand different things from the figures. But to come back to the question of the WTO being the point of reference, I think that Israel definitely will like that. The question is to what extent the WTO can be a point of reference anymore. And that's an open question that we don't know. Okay? Now, you mentioned also that we should, and actually we did, in parallel with the government, I mean the private sector, we conducted our own studies trying to see what could be the potential for Brexit. And obviously everybody said, well, maybe it is a potential for the private sector to increase and to have a better agreement with the UK than with the EU. Now, what we see is that, well, they haven't succeeded in having a better agreement, at least we have the same type of agreement. To what extent we could have had a better agreement, I've got my doubt about it, but we see how the things will go on if we understand that this is going to be the scenario. So we have still hope, maybe in the future, with the first consultation, after there is a Brexit and after you know how the Brexit is, we can then maybe on the basis of a more clear picture actually ask for more. So I think that in that sense we will be on the demanding side once we know a bit more what's the situation, because definitely I think it's an opportunity to take advantage, and I think the British side also would like to do that, because they will also have to show benefit from the Brexit. So if they can show that Brexit has improved trade relations with some countries, I think that the British will also like to do that. So in that case, I think that after we see what is the process, there is room for actually increasing, making, and again, we might therefore definitely on the agricultural sector, you mentioned it, I think that's an opportunity, but I think on the, and because Israel, as you also mentioned rightly, we are moving more and more from the goods trade into services. I think that in the area of services, we could look what are the opportunities there for the relation. I know that again, it is related to WTO because there is still on the table somewhere a general agreement on traded services, but maybe we can go with the UK in having some additional, or maybe to go deeper in the actually service side, and that could serve, by the way, as an example for what we can do with other countries. By the way, it's very interesting that once the UK is out, we still have a very, I mean, we will be probably, together with the UK, the only we'll be both member of the OECD, a non-member of the EU, obviously, and then the question is whether we could take advantage of that specific situation. I don't know, we have to explore it, whether that gives us some advantages. At least I can say that we can probably also maybe lobby together vis-à-vis the EU, okay, and find some other places where we can work together with the UK, maybe again, not against the EU, but definitely create a joint front with the UK on certain issues that maybe will come up in the EU. So we can develop a closer link and a closer connection with the UK. Here again, and I'm sure that the next speaker will touch on that, it depends a lot of what type of government we're going to have in the UK, because if there are new elections and we find ourselves with a certain other leader, although it doesn't look like that, but if Corbyn comes to power, then it's a whole different new ball game, and then all what we're talking here is going to change totally. So it's also depending on what type of government we have in the UK in order to see whether we can really form an alliance with the UK. One aspect which I think it's very interesting and people don't speak about it enough, and I'm now dealing with that quite deeply, is this new dimension of security in Europe, which, as you know, and actually Maya mentioned it in the beginning, the UK already is not part of PESCO. Okay? PESCO is this permanent structure of cooperation. There is the EDA, the European Defence Agency, there is ETF, European Defence Fund. Now, obviously, security, defense is something that we all know that in Israel is very important. We all know the special relation we have with the US, and we know that with Europe, as in its current situation, we are still looking to the possibility, yes or no, participating in some research and development program on the defense area. I think that here the fact that the UK will be out, will have a more independent position, could maybe facilitate, or eventually we can develop a dialogue on security and defense issue with the UK. I know that it hasn't been always easy, because the UK has had, and again, I don't want to enter into to what extent the fact that the UK goes out of the EU will change the EU position with Israel, or will change the UK position with Israel, to what extent the fact that the UK was in the EU did influence their position. I let that to political scientists, but it is a new situation. So it is something worthwhile to explore to what extent the defense dimension has here opportunities, and again for the private sector. We know that, for instance, just to give you an example, there are plenty of, some big British companies, defense, have already very strong ties with the US. There are some very strong cooperation between the US and the UK in defense. And again, we are strong in our relation with the US. That could create something new with, again, UK company, American company, Israeli company. This is something worthwhile looking into and worthwhile seeing what we can do on that level. The same, by the way, it has some parallel to, here it was mentioned, the issue of Horizon 2020 and Horizon, the new Horizon. Here again, we used to have, many years ago, it was called Reich. I don't know if some people remember. There was a bilateral research and development attempt between Israel and the UK to have kind of like we have the Bird Foundation with the US, so there was an attempt to have a BrightTech with Israel-Britain Technology Fund. It died up because we joined the Horizon, or the 5th program, the 6th program, etc. It might be interesting to check whether we can, because there is, it's true on the one hand, still Horizon, but maybe we can develop our own tool of cooperation in research and development with the UK. I mean, you know, UK are very strong, especially in basic science, etc. So in that case, I think this is something that we should explore in having a parallel channel on research and development with the UK. So now I mentioned here other, the area of, again, tourism. I think that you mentioned the open sky, I mentioned tourism in general. I think this is an area where there could be much more development. I mentioned agriculture, investment, financial services, security. In the monetary or banking sector, those are areas where, again, we will see changes, and definitely there is a potential for enlarging the cooperation. Again, I think that for the time being, as private sector, we have to hope that things will be a bit more clear, because, as I said, uncertainty is really not good. And I hope that we will continue to have a very open and straightforward dialogue with the government on that. I must say that also from the British side, our counterpart, the CBI, I think for many years we didn't have such an open dialogue with them, because they were, just to give you an example, the CBI, all their international activity was very limited. The only office they had was in Brussels. So as the private sector, they had their they went through a reorganization, and when I went several times to the UK to try to establish a relation between us, private sector, and the British private sector, said, well, yes, it's nice, you are a nice guy, but our external relations, especially with Europe, and we have an office in Brussels, so we wait and see. I think that this time, maybe the attitude of the private sector in Britain might change, and that would be interesting to develop also more business-to-business relation. Let's hope that this is going to be the situation, and we are going to seize the opportunity to try and do that. That's roughly what I wanted, just to give some teasers about what we are looking at, and as we see that, there is one, and again, another just to mention, a lot of Israeli investors abroad, and you know that Israel is becoming a net investor abroad, and Britain or London was definitely a destination for a lot of investors in real estate. So I don't know if they did a good deal or not a good deal. If they invested in pound, I'm not sure that it's a good deal because it went down. But in any case, there are strong ties also in the sense of Israeli companies that had set up in the UK their headquarters, and I think that they came to us in order to say whether we should keep our headquarters there or move it from the UK, etc. Again, a lot depends on what is the outreach of those companies, where is their market. Obviously, their market is mainly the European market, so it's true that it's easier maybe for Israeli to sit in London, because just to remind you that I think besides Britain, only one more country will have English as a language of work. Okay, so it's a bit bizarre. So in a sense, for Israelis, it's much easier to work in London than to work in Paris in terms of language-wise. But So we'll see, but we definitely told in our companies that they should definitely contemplate relocating from London if all their major operation is not actually in the UK. So that's about it, and I'm ready to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fascinating as always. Thank you so much. And so we already heard some legal aspects from Arie and the Ministry of Economy from Daniel, and the private sector from Daniel. And now we finally have Professor David Newman to hear some political aspects. He served as a Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev from 2010 to 2016. Received the OBE in 2013 for his work in promoting scientific cooperation between Israel and the UK. From 1999 to 2014, he was chief editor of the International Journal of Geopolitics. He moved to Israel from the UK in 1982. His work in geopolitics focuses on territorial and border issues in Israel and Palestine. And in recent years, he has spent time researching the history of Anglo Jewry and teaches courses on British politics. So,
okay, thank you. Oh, I need this. Okay,
yes,
thank you very much. For those of you who used to be fans of the great Monty Python, now for something completely different. In two respects. One, I'm going to give a lecture based on caricatures. Those of you who have heard me speak on my real topic, borders, know I love caricatures. I suppose I've now developed a second collection on Brexit. I won't be able to show all of the ones I have in this PowerPoint, so I'm not too worried that my updated version of the PowerPoint isn't actually the one on the screen. I added a few more later on this morning. They sort of run as a background. I think you'll all agree with me that humour is humour, but humour can be very serious political commentary. And there's nothing like a good caricature to really raise some of the questions. So you can both laugh and cry at one and the same caricatures. I really want to speak about what's happening in Britain and Brexit. I don't know what's happening. I do know what's happening, as well as many of you may or may not know. And it's impossible, of course, to prophesy. You asked the question, how many of you think this, that, and the other? I've been very careful not to prophesy anything about Brexit, but I made one mistake, and there are even a few people here in this room who I wrote it to, and that is, after Boris came into power, about 2 months, well, he's been how long now? 3 months in as Prime Minister. After about a month, I said, you know what? This guy, I may think he's a bit of a whatever, but Britain's going to leave the EU on the 31st of October. And I was pretty convinced about that, and I think he was as well, but of course Parliament, in a sense, tied his hands. And I think there are a number of very interesting questions to raise about British politics, number one, but also there are wider issues which come out of British politics and which reflect on other issues which I think EU countries and Israel have to think about, because there are themes which are going on here. When I grew up in Britain as a kid, we then, what we call Bagrut here, you then studied what was called O-levels and A-levels. And A-levels was sort of on half the way to university as well. You only studied 3 topics. And if you wanted to study something which is akin to Ezrahut, to citizenship, to civic politics, you studied something called the British Constitution. Now, that is an anomaly because Britain doesn't have a constitution, nor does Israel. But Israel is much closer to having a written constitution than Britain is. And of course, as someone who every 4 or 5 years teaches a course, a basic course on British politics here to students, one of the great things I like explaining is, you know, showing particularly bits from the Parliament, bits from Yes Minister and Prime Minister, with which I will finish this presentation, and saying, you know, even without a written constitution, things are pretty smooth. They have stable government. They normally, not always, have 2-party majority governments, and things work very well without a written constitution. Well, along has come Brexit and has proved all that to be wrong and to be very different. And I think there are some structural questions which have been brought up by Brexit, which I don't think the British public or public street can really avoid if and when Brexit is done and they can start thinking, getting back to thinking about other things. There are some real issues concerning democracy, concerning constitution, concerning elections, concerning referenda, which I think could well have implications also for Israel. If one day we were to have a referendum on a peace agreement, that looks a bit messianic at the moment, but nevertheless, there are a number of issues which have to be raised which have never been really discussed in depth in Britain because everything's worked so well and so nicely. I can hardly believe that over the past few weeks, and I've spent a lot of the last 2 years back on Shabbaton, sabbatical in England, so I've got quite caught up in the Brexit debate. I find it quite funny because often I end up on Israeli radio talking about Brexit, and on English radio talking about Israeli elections, which is an interesting comparison. But what I can hardly believe is that this soap opera called Brexit has really caught me up. And I find myself sometimes listening to a parliamentary debate, because of course parliamentary debates in England are theatre, if they're not anything else, and listening to the issues raised because there are some constitutional issues which are being raised today in the parliamentary debate which have not been raised in Britain for a long time. And as you rightly said, Sky News now says any morning, if you want to hear Sky News without Brexit, turn to this other channel, because it is a soap opera and you have to feel a bit crazy to do it as much. A lot of Brexit is about demagoguery, and you can decide whether this is a good advert which has been thrown around recently, or whether it's just part of the demagoguery which has gone around Brexit. The figures are correct. The actual figures are correct. The question is how you interpret them. 17.4 million voted to leave, 16 million voted to remain, so a very narrow majority. Azoray Bechira, 406 constituencies to leave, 242 to remain, 148 Labour Conservative, Region 9-3, and yet in the MPs 160 to 486. That was then, of course, these things change every other week as different proposals come up. Which means to say, and I think it's a question you can raise in many countries in the world, are therefore the elected representatives of the political system out of sync with the country? But of course the country is more than just the 33 million people who did vote. A lot of people didn't vote, but at the same time we often say after elections and after referenda, you didn't vote, tough luck mate. But who are the people who didn't vote? Normally certain groups don't vote, and it's very clear that this, in the referendum 3.5 years ago, there were certain groups who didn't vote. One, because maybe there wasn't enough information on the table, because they weren't really interested, or because, like me, and I would dare to say, like everyone sitting in this room, no one believed that there was going to be a majority for Remain. I was actually on Israeli TV that night, following the results coming in, and we were all convinced there's going to be nothing here. And of course, we were all left, like everywhere around the world, completely gobsmacked, as they say in England, by the fact that the majority voted to leave, because when you have an ideological issue out there, as Nick Farage did and still has, more people go for the ideological thing than for the thing they think is just going to move over smoothly. And of course this was one of the great demagogic arguments back in 1916, Nigel Farage showing hundreds of immigrants behind him, because a lot of the Brexit debate at the time was caught up in the xenophobic debate about stopping refugees, particularly refugees from countries which are not Christian and which are not European, from coming into England. And that was, of course, a very powerful message which spoke, unfortunately in my own personal view, but nevertheless spoke to the heart of many what you would call grassroots people not living in London, those who voted to leave. And so Britain believed that, or at least those who voted to leave, believed, free at last from the yoke of the EU, free at last from the yoke of other people telling us how to make our decisions.
Ireland is missing, is that deliberate?
I think just for this caricaturist, I don't think in this particular caricature it had sense. And of course, we are going to put the great back into Great Britain. This was the great slogan, particularly of the older generation, rather than the young generation, because the younger generation, much, much younger than me, don't even know what Great Britain was or what the Great in Great Britain was, but for the older generation this seemed to be something very important. So they all believe that free at last we will now be the great independent island in a world of globalization, a world of global trade treaties. We can do our own thing, we don't need those continentals, that's a better word they use than Europeans, telling us how to run our affairs. Of course there are many different definitions of what Brexit is about in England. One is the undefined being negotiated by the unprepared in order to get the unspecified for the uninformed. And of course one of the great things about Brexit is that I think, we did go through a period of 3 years, from 16 through until Theresa May was forced to step down and Boris came. And again, for the smooth running of British politics, when you think back, British Parliament wasted 3 years when it didn't really deal with the issues because they weren't sure, because they too were unclear as to what this result meant. And so for 3 years, and I think one of the things that I can say, and I'm not a Boris Johnson supporter, I'm definitely in my personal side a big Remainer, but I think he certainly understood that you have to come to grips with this. You can't have a country going on and on and on, and maybe not, I think, in your opening remarks saying, or somebody's opening remarks saying, well, in 100 years, this will be the day we come and decide whether to apply for an extension. One of the things where the British political system has clearly failed here has to take the result of Brexit, whether they like the result or they don't like the result, and move ahead with it. And that's something I think that Johnson wanted to do, so that you can get it behind you one way or the other, because I think to a great extent, a lot of the British public are fed up with Brexit, they're bored with Brexit, and even a lot of the Remainers will say, let's at least get this thing behind us and move on and get back to dealing with other issues. Another definition of Brexit, I thought I had one here, I must be on the updated version. I had another great definition of Brexit, which I can send to you. And so along comes Boris Johnson, he says, how does our great democracy with its unwritten constitution work? We are the first and best democracy. Nothing makes me more proud. Well, it's quite easy. I'm a non-elected Prime Minister. I'm heading a minority government, voted by 42% in the elections, of course, voted into power just by a few hundred or a few thousand members, as a matter of fact. Firstly, a few hundred MPs, and the final vote was the members of the Conservative Party. I just received approval of a 93-year-old monarch to suspend our elected Parliament to make radical regime change. We all know what happened with that in the High Court. In Britain, it is very rare for political issues to be discussed. First of all, the concept of a Supreme High Court is something very recent in Britain. Last 20 years, Tony Blair brought it in for the first time. And unlike Israel, where so many political issues get discussed in the High Court, this British Supreme Court does not usually deal with political issues. It's dealt with very few political issues. And once they define it as being a political issue, they will say, we don't want to touch it. But they decided to touch this issue of Johnson persuading the monarch to signing the agreement of, what was the word to, I forgot the word now.
Parole?
Parole, yes, it's an English word. I think my English is fairly good. I'm, past 60, I know the English word. I didn't know the word parole before.
It's something people invent when they play Scrabble.
Oh, I said, okay, I play Scrabble as well. Okay. And then, of course, we have two great political leaders. Boris Johnson, who, by hook or crook, wants to just go ahead with it, bulldoze it through, and is unfortunate, as far as he's concerned, met the whole time by barriers of a parliament which doesn't know with him, and Jeremy Corbyn, who just, I think people aren't really sure what he wants. He would like to replace, obviously, Johnson. The amazing thing about yes election or no election is that in any other time, any other political leader of the Labour Party, if he was more of a middle-of-the-road social democrat and not on the radical left as Corbyn is, given the, there's only one word to it, the balagan. You know what a balagan is. It's just a big mess up, but it's something which can't really be translated into any other language. Of what the Conservatives has done, under any other leader, Labour would be 20-30% ahead in the polls. And the fact is they remain 20-30% behind in the polls. Corbyn doesn't rise up. And tomorrow, when there is the vote on will there be a general election in December, Corbyn's going to be lucky because there won't be the special two-thirds majority needed to pass that into action, because he really doesn't want an election as much as he says he wants an election, because he knows, I think so, that he's going to get beaten very badly, even by a Boris Johnson who is behaving in the way he is. And I think that's a fair way that many British people summarise what's going on in the British cabinet today. I could go into my favourite topic of talking about football, the Manchester teams got knocked out of Europe very quickly, so Theresa May sought their advice how to get out of Europe quickly, but then I can put on my favourite team, there's someone here I know who appreciates that, and say, you know, with both Liverpool and Tottenham at the end of the European Cup last year, they were both well out of Europe, and with 20 minutes to go, and they both found ways of staying in there. There are many people who believe that the ongoing debate about Brexit, Britain is simply going to stay there and stay there and stay there and not get out. There are issues of passport and borders, which I don't have time to talk about. Everything's been brought up. Backstop has brought up borders again, of course, it goes without saying. No hard border, and I really love this one because we keep going back, let's have a second referendum, let's have a second referendum, and this comes back to your opening comments. I hope so. I was too young to vote in the first one, and this is in a sense a war of attrition, but it does raise questions. I come back to my opening comments and say, this is what happens actually when finally the concept of an unwritten or a non-constitution, unwritten constitution, is finally challenged. It hasn't been challenged over so long because British political culture has always stepped in and ruled the day. In this case, culture hasn't overruled the lack of a constitution, and so it's going on with each time different. And here's, of course, Corbyn worried about the elections. This is 2 months old, before Boris had the deal on the table, and before he thought of calling general elections again, which I don't think he's going to get through tomorrow, and I don't think really the situation has changed. And if you will allow me, I want to finish with, it's a 90-second video clip of Yes Minister. This was shown, Yes Minister Prime Minister, at the end of the 70s, the early 80s, and is discussing Europe and the British attitude towards Europe. So, is there sound on this? I hope there is.
I hope.
Yes and no.
We'll get the sound going, we'll start it again.
The White is pro-Europe because it is really anti-Europe. The civil service was united in its desire to make sure that the common market didn't work. That's why we went in. Britain has had the same foreign policy objective for at least the last 500 years, to create a disunited Europe. In that cause, we have Germans against the French, and the French and Italians against the Germans, and with the French against the Germans and Italians. Divide and rule. Why should we change now, when it's worked so well? A true history, surely, and current policy. We had to break the whole thing up, so we had to get inside. We tried to break it up from the outside, but that didn't work. Now that we're inside, we can make a complete pig's breakfast of the whole thing. Set the Germans against the French against the Italians against the Dutch. The foreign office is terribly busy, it's just like old times.
Surely you're committed to the European ideal. Why are we pressing for an increase in the membership?
Well, for the same reason. It's just like the United Nations, in fact. The more members it has, the more arguments it can stir up, the more futile and impotent it becomes.
Appalling cynicism.
Yes. We call it diplomacy,
There's only one thing wrong, which is, of course, that today, within the EU, most of the major countries are united in their way that they want to deal with Britain. I have to admit that I'm surprised that they're even prepared to consider an extension, and I think it's less because of the trade issues and more because of the idea they don't want the precedent of someone finally leaving easily, because there are other countries out there in the satellite which may think about it. And so I think it's a much bigger issue. Sorry, one more issue I have to raise, and that is the issue of the referendum. I passed by it very quickly. The referendum, both in Israel and England, is something which isn't used, virtually never used. We haven't had one in Israel outside elections. In England, they've only ever had 3, 2 of which have been to do with Europe. Because of the idea, don't need to tell the political scientists, the idea that you elect representatives. Why would people want to be elected as representatives? At the end of the day, they go with all the big issues to the people. So obviously there's a big debate within political science about what is the role of a referendum within parliamentary democracy. And there are arguments for and against. But one thing that was clearly done very badly here, if you're going to have a referendum, it has to be clear that a referendum is not just to advise a government, it's to make a decision. But that was left out in the open, it was left in the air. It was just a very simple question with a lot of information lacking on the table. And beyond that, I think in most cases where countries do occasionally have a referendum beyond the general elections, they say we need a special majority. So that you're not going to come up with 51% against 49%. I mean, I don't need to tell you, if one day, as I say, it sounds a bit messianic, but if one day Israel was to get back into peace negotiations and they were to say, we've got to bring this to a referendum, it's been, by the way, it's on the law books in Israel at the moment, it would have to be, if such thing were to happen, to come and say it's going to be 51% to 49%, and then there are going to be those who argue that the Arab citizens of Israel should take part or shouldn't take part. There's going to be a debate about democracy on that. And what is the question and what are the alternatives? If you're going to have a referendum, you have to make the conditions of it extremely clear. And here Britain failed horrifically because they didn't make it clear that this was not going to be a decision. It was just going, some say it was just advisory. Along come Nick Farage and everyone and say, look, the British people decided to a certain extent, and I say it as a Remainer, they did to a certain extent, and it's very harmful to democracy then to come back and say, let's have a second and a third referendum because not all the information was on the table, because there are many young people today who are pro-Europe who didn't vote at the time. So I think the whole concept of referendum and referenda need to be rethought, and I leave you with this final thought.
Thank you. So it was a great idea to open up with a Brexit joke and to end up with not only Brexit caricatures but also great ideas. So now we are having about 10 minutes for some observations, short observations and good questions. Neil.
So,
Minister, just say your name.
Here goes to the Ministry of Justice. I would first like to commend my colleagues from the Ministry of Economy and my academic supervisor from the law faculty at Bar-Ilan that there is a standing open skies agreement between Israel and the UK, which has replaced the UK's obligation under the EU-Israel open skies agreement. I do have to also ask a question as a fellow graduate of the College of Europe in Bruges, one of the few Israelis that did the ethos of, and worried about the ethos of European integration, whether or not do you think other countries will follow suit after, if the Brexit will happen? Do you think that the other countries are looking and thinking, if they're going to strike a deal, we're going to go for it too, and who are the countries that are going to do it, and why?
All right, thank you. And try maybe when you ask a question, if you wanted to ask a specific speaker, or just the whole panel.
Whoever wants to take the...
To Dan Catarivas. All righty.
Well, this one's to Newman. Thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it very much. I think the question of our times, and Brexit is just a particular case, is how to resolve the ethics of democracy, the need to legitimize policy by everyone, every citizen, with the increasing complexity of policy. The problem of referendums is that you cannot simply put a referendum to people. That is the fact. Real serious referendums are no longer possible. The questions are too complex. They don't fit on a sheet. They are not much comprehended by people who are not involved or did not study. There's a yawning gap between the representatives of the people, the complex issue they have to deal with, And it's a challenge to democracy, and it's not just in Europe, and it's not just in parliamentary democracies, and it's a problem in many countries. And you see people responding by voting in clowns into office, or by voting, people who simply are better liars. That's what it takes these days.
And Nigel Farage.
Well, I'm not naming names. So my question to you is whether you think that the way things will be resolved in Britain will serve any lesson to other places.
And by the way, Ramses, if you wish to add something, feel free, please.
Yes. Very shortly, a footnote to what Arie and Reich you said. I myself agree with you that there should be, if we roll back and go back to before 73, there should be some opportunities for Israelis to sell more agricultural and food products in Britain. However, you forgot to mention that since 2009, there is an almost free trade agreement in agricultural products that went through between the EU and Israel, so that many of these obstacles have been already eliminated in trade between the EU and Israel. So don't make too much of it. That's my first. The second one relates to nobody here related to the very important item in the single market that changed now, which is the freedom of movement between the UK and the European labor markets. Now, I was thinking that this could have an influence on Israel in two ways. First, in the direction of Britain to the continent. It's obvious that British people had for them in the past, before Brexit, 27 labor markets to go to work. Now, this is going to be closed, at least for those who are not already in the union, which makes me think that for the rules of trade diversion, or call it what you want, there might be more that might be interested in the Israeli labor market, because now those two labor markets, the one of Israel and the one of the European Union member countries, will be at par for them. That's one thing. And maybe it might even encourage some aliyah from Britain. That's one. The other point is in the reverse direction. Many Israelis have double citizenship, and this has been increasing in recent times. Most of them, when they have a European citizenship, it's not from Britain, as you know very well. Okay? On top of it, many Israelis, when they had to choose where to use these passports from Europe, they would choose the English labor market, because they know English. That was mentioned by Daniel Catarivas. Now there is a new situation. So there are Israeli citizens that took a European passport with the purpose to work in Britain. And now this is finished. I wanted only to mention this in passing.
They will go to Portugal.
Just to ask a short, thank you so much.
I support very much what he said, I forget his name, but I think a referendum is the democracy of the future. And I suggest for you and for Ilan to work on this, to prepare some proposals, suggestions. There's 5 universities, 4 universities, School of Law, prepare 4 versions of combining the references within the working political system. Because I think most of the young people in Israel and in Europe, they want a referendum. And now with the new techniques that there are, you have to put it in the constitution, you have to prepare all the supporting aids and whatever, but it is right in Israel about the territories to bring it to the referendum, because with all the other things there are no differences. And it's a challenge I put before you and before Ilan and other Tel Aviv.
Thank you very much. 2 last questions, please.
Short questions to Dan and Daniel, but to be relevant to the others as well. What are actually the opportunities that Brexit poses to Israel? Take it that the UK is going to be not continue to be a member state, but a third country. What can Britain open that can actually allow Israel to advance its relations with the EU?
Thank you. Noga?
I have a comment, but I would like to hear a response from the panel to it, and I'll keep it as short as possible. The British people have decided that they want to leave the European Union. They didn't think about it very much. They didn't say it was the best possible solution for them. They don't even necessarily think that it's a good idea. But that is in fact the decision that they've made. They made it in the referendum, and from what we see in newspapers, they are making it again with everything that they're told. With all of the complications, the fact that Boris Johnson is making as much progress as he is, and the fact that he got elected is an indication for the fact that the British people want to leave the European Union. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have today, we have it in Israel, we have it in Europe, we definitely have it in the United Kingdom, is not necessarily the complication of a policy and the need to explain it to the people. It's the need to accept the fact that people can make choices that are not good for them. And that is the essence of democracy. And we could also go into the fact that sometimes there is wisdom in the masses, and that when people make a decision as a group, it may be the one that serves them. But we also have to understand that the reason why we keep seeing buffoons getting elected is because when we ignore what it is that the people want and we decide that we know better, they will just go to the further extremes to make sure that we understand that that is in fact what they want. I think the biggest, when we talk about democratic deficiency, and we talk about the fact that people don't want the European Union to dictate to them what to do, when we ignore that, what we get is a lot of clowns or buffoons elected to make sure that we can no longer ignore it. And I think one of the biggest challenges that the European Union is facing is how, when Brexit does come to pass, and I think that is what Boris Johnson is going for, how to avoid that happening again with the next buffoon, with the next group of people. And it might not necessarily be on the European level, it could be the Catalans in Spain, but what would happen when the next people decide that they've had enough with someone telling them that they know better, and they don't want the complication explained, they just want their decision done.
Thank you. So, Bertrand.
I'll be very quick. First of all, regarding agriculture, Alfred, I don't think there's free trade in agriculture between us and the EU. I think there are still quotas, there are tariff quotas, there are subsidies, there's all kinds of things going on. We're far from having free trade. I mean, us in Israel, I mean, look at that, what's going on. We can't bring in vegetables, whatever we want. It's not free. Now, regarding referendum, I tend to agree with Tal. I think it's hard to find countries where referenda actually work. I mean, look at the referendum in Cyprus about the peace agreement. It didn't make any sense, in my opinion. And you have countries that, I mean, we've had several referenda in the European Union also. Danish referendum and Irish referendum.
Switzerland.
Yes, so the Swiss exception is all about having as small a government as you can have. So the whole thing, the pot is smaller. A lot less is at stake.
No, leave it to
Switzerland is the
combination.
I'm from school too.
Okay, so you have to work now. In America it works, by the way.
I think the only country where you have direct democracy works is Switzerland, and it's an exception. It's an exception to the rule, and you need to be Swiss for it to work. There are so many other things that only work in Switzerland.
The French Air Force works in Switzerland. They guard their skies.
So Swiss Air is not working
anymore in Switzerland. I think it was Platon, I think, who said that if I want my shoes fixed, I bring it to a specialist shoemaker. Why would I give my state, my polis, to be governed by all these masses, by anyone? So I think representative democracy is a better way of going, and still you can change if the masses, if the majority is not happy with the way government is going, they can choose a different party who presents a different policy, and they will change the policy, and that's okay. But it will be done in a more, it will be done in a more sophisticated way, in a more, by a more professional way, and they'll know what they're doing, and they know basically what the people want, but they will then go ahead and implement it in a reasonable manner. I think, in my opinion, that's a better way of going. And regarding which other country is going to leave the EU, wow, הנבואה ניתנה לשוטים ואני לא שותה.
So, I will might ask questions about opportunities, but I will say, since it's on the subject, and just Professor Reich just talked about before, I think it was Churchill said that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. That's funny, but it also includes all the people sitting in this room. So, yeah, he also said also very interesting things about democracy in general, and in general, a lot of good quotes. I thought I would see some quotes by Churchill here, but anyways, regarding opportunities, I think I had a couple of things there on the presentation. One of them being the possibility with the UK to expand the trading partnership agreements to cover areas that are currently not covered in the EU association agreement. So things that are very important, such as services and investment, and increase the scope and the commitment. In general, in trade relations, I think Israel, I think, at this point has very good relations on a bilateral level with a lot of member states. We know that sometimes it's not so easy dealing with Brussels. So, of course, when you have to deal with the UK on a bilateral level, then that could present some opportunities. I'm not sure, but maybe. And then, of course, considering that there will be no single market, if there will be, I mean, it seems like in any case, there will be no single market, and the current advantage that European companies have over Israeli companies, it will cease to exist, and even more so if there will be no agreement, so Israeli companies will have an advantage over European companies. So these are just a couple of examples, but I should say, by the way, that the UK, when we talk about the day after Brexit, with a deal or I mean without a deal, the UK published a tariff that will be for 1 year. It's a tariff. So when you look at the custom duties that countries collect on products, if we look at Israel, for example, about 50% of of the products of the tariff items, what we call, they don't have any duties when you import them to Israel. But the UK, in order to facilitate and to make it more, not to less of a chaos, let's say, they have decided to grant 88% of the products imported into the UK in the first year a duty-free regime. So that's important to mention also. It's in terms of the volume of the trade, not the number of tariff lines. But that, of course, will eventually change. So Israel is in a position that it has, or we will have the day after Brexit, free trade agreement, and so we will have an advantage over other competing countries. the competition today is global, so we have to always think about it in these terms, which is why we keep working on expanding our free trade agreements that are currently covering, by the way, about 70% of our trade, our free trade agreements.
And I mean, the devil in the detail. So we had to carry on a study on trying to identify those products that we could expand and could enlarge. But as far as I remember, there's no big thing over there. So as Daniel said, I mean, we don't